again with another pay practitioners panel. In fact, this is actually a very special pay practitioners panel for a couple of reasons. For the first reason, this is actually this group's last pay practitioners panel. Um, and then we're going to be starting another one in a couple of weeks. But this is also a very special pay practitioners panel because we are joined by Jon Burg, who is a partner over at Infinite Equity and is going to really help us kind of have this conversation today with the rest of the panelists about managing equity programs through periods of uncertainty. So, if you haven't joined us before on a pay practitioners panel, we like to kind of go through and start off with a quick round of introductions. I'll go first, and then we'll go kind of clockwise, and that should be Jon, James, Chad, Clay, and then Justin. But for myself, I am Justin Hampton. I am the founder of Compensation Tool, or kind of as we call it now, Comp Tool. I've been a compensation practitioner for about 15 years, working at companies such as Starbucks, Greyhound Line, and some gaming companies both here in the US and in the UK. Before we started Comp Tool and our data solution we affectionately call Squirrel. So thank you guys for joining us. Jon.
Hey, Justin, thank you very much for having me here. I'm excited about this topic. As you can imagine by the name in our company, equity is something we kind of hold near and dear to our heart. So always excited to share some perspectives, but as well as gain some insights from others. And so I'm sure it's going to be a two-way road on this one. But first off, Jon Burg, one of the founders of Infinite Equity. We started a little over 4 years ago. And we are a collection of about 40 employees that kind of span the spectrum of having design related expertise within equity to education with direct education to employees. We administer programs on the various systems. And then we have a compliance group that does all the nitty-gritty stuff, valuation, tax, accounting, disclosure. Hopefully we won't get too far into the weeds in any of those topics and kind of keep it more around managing design programs, but very excited to be here.
Thanks, Jon. So James Seachan from the NOAA Group. I'm based here in San Francisco, and I work across various areas of total rewards, cash compensation, equity, and sales compensation. And Jon, good to see you. For the audience, I know Jon from our time at Aon together. I think we met in 2012, maybe. I can't quite remember. At the office in San Francisco. But yeah, good to be back.
Great. Thanks, James. Chad, how about yourself?
Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. Chad Atwell. I'm with Red Cat Systems, and I work with our clients sort of managing their compensation and performance comp cycles with our technology. I've got background across consulting and technology with companies like Oracle and Aon and Deloitte as well. So happy to be back, and also sort of looking forward to the break as well. As much as I like these conversations, it's good to have some spare time on a Friday as well. So, but thanks.
All right. Thanks, Clay.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Clay Johnson here. I'm coming to you from Salt Lake City, Utah area, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I always find equity such a fascinating topic, and I've been in the broader HR space for about 15 years and have specialized in compensation and total rewards over time, and now run a total rewards and comp consulting firm as part of GBS. And yeah, just happy to be part of this panel with these great people.
Thanks, Clay. And Justin Sun, happy to have you back and round us out.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. Justin Sun. I'm a compensation advisor at Expedia Group based in Seattle. And I have pretty much spent my entire career within the reward space and have worked in a few different industries from consumer packaged goods to aerospace and retail and tech, and now currently within travel. And I'm really excited to be part of this group and just thankful for this compensation community where we can really share a lot of great practices and ideas.
Yeah. No. Well, thanks everybody. And again, we're super happy to have everybody here. And thanks, John, for kind of helping us through this conversation today. So, I think that the conversation today is around managing equity programs through uncertain periods. John, do you think that we're entering one of those uncertain periods right now, or have we been in the last couple of years?
It's a great question, and as you'll find in a lot of the discussion here, the short answer and the most annoying one is it depends. But the reason that that's appropriate is every company, every industry, when it comes to equity, it has potentially a different situation, even within the same industry, because there could be size differences, there could be locations, and so forth. So I like your question as a starting point to get back to that framing that you'll see me do repeatedly, is to try to provide some context in how one company might answer that versus another. So I think we've certainly been in some uncertain times, really kind of going back to beginning of 2020 when the pandemic really kind of disrupted all our lives. A quick period of uncertainty for everyone, but as we saw, many industries actually phased or even fueled by the change happening around to our daily. With that said, there were certainly some industries, travel, heavy ones, that really suffered and suffered more than other industries. Those seem to be rebounding. Tech, being on the opposite end of the spectrum, really thrived during the pandemic. And in some cases may have, in late 2021, had some valuations, both in the public space and the private space, that were at a little bit of a high water mark, maybe overvalued in some opinions. And so when we look at just last year, when kind of inflation became part more of the dialogue, we saw a pretty significant correction that hit a lot of tech and emerging industries, much differently than the ones that had suffered more during the pandemic. So I think we've been in a period of uncertainty for quite some time, and one could probably argue, depending on whose perspective, it's always uncertain times. Where a lot of the beauty around equity comes into play is equity at its heart is incredibly flexible in terms of how you design it. And so where I'll kind of come back to is about you establish a strategy or a design, but you also think through how it needs to be flexible and reactive to changing circumstances. And then based off of the questions you guys have, and maybe from the audience, drill into some of those civic scenarios. So we're not always lofty in the clouds. I love getting into the weeds with you. So short answer is uncertain times.
You're muted, Justin.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair answer. I mean, I think it is oftentimes uncertain. We unfortunately can't predict the future. So, it's especially when we consider the equity component of compensation programs to be generally forward-facing or longer term over multiple years. There is that component that is always uncertain. So, and I'll let anyone else in the panel jump in with any questions, because full transparency, the equity piece, I would have been coming to John for advice because it's not my area of expertise. But as we're designing, one question I would have as a fairly high starting point is, as you're designing these new equity programs, at what point do we kind of look to say that these programs are working effectively versus non-effectively? What would be some of the measures that you put in place when you would suggest that maybe a reevaluation of that equity program is appropriate?
Yeah, great question as well. So I think in kind of addressing, it's important to kind of take a step back, think about how we establish a design, or even more broadly an equity strategy. And I love you make about kind of having a comp background, maybe not as specific or in the weeds on the equity component. The thing that I like to kind of draw a contrast to is equity strategy, while it compensation philosophy that can build off of the broader total rewards philosophy, there's some really unique aspects to it. And so if I can contrast it, if we're doing a compensation study or releveling, a couple components there that are givens that are not necessarily a given on the equity side. And these probably seem obvious, but sometimes when you say them out loud, you're like, oh yeah. So first off, when we think about cash wages, whether a salary or an hourly rate, it's a given that your employees are going to receive it, right? There's no question as to, are you going to get it? And further, there's no question as to how often you're going to get it, right? It may be semi-monthly or semi-weekly, but there's a cadence. So everyone's going to get it, and we know how often they're going to get it, right? But sometimes we kind of take that for granted when we think about equity. Equity, we can start with a similar philosophy that we benchmark at a certain percentile, and it's all about attract, reward, and retain. But as soon as you go that next level down and start asking some of the questions around, all right, well, who's eligible? And is it eligible higher? And is the question different when we think about refreshes? And then when we go down the next step, okay, refreshes, well, when do they get it? How often after hire? And is it same eligibility? And further, is it the same participation rate? So your position may be eligible, but maybe we truly are defining this as performance-made grants, performance-determined grants. And so maybe the participation rate is much lower. So all of that is just to kind of illustrate the ideas around the compensation philosophy, while just as important on the cash side, are really important on the equity, because if you don't have that compensation philosophy and further some very specific objectives that you're trying to achieve, and I'll come back and talk about those objectives, but if you don't have those defined, then you get down to all these other decisions, and if you don't have that North Star, you've kind of lost your way. You come to a fork in the road, and despite what Yogi Berra said, you take it, you might take the wrong one. And that's what I think often happens where companies perceive they may have a problem with the equity program. Don't always know kind of where it went off the rails. And Justin, to your point, they don't always know a way to really kind of look at it and determine if they really have a problem. A great example that we see a little bit more often in private company space, just because of the kind of reduction of stock option prevalence based in public companies, but constantly get a question of, we have underwater options. Should we reprice? Should we exchange? And I'll tell you, having been involved in probably about 100 stock option exchanges from start, I've been involved in assessing whether there really is an underwater problem and or should something be done about it 5 times as many. And so that's illustrative of the fact that when you dig, oftentimes you realize where you have the problem or you think the solution is to do X, Y, and Z. Once you really kind of dig in and start looking at how many people have underwater options, how long they're water, what's the likelihood the stock price can recover, oftentimes the answer is not the obvious one. Exchange or repricing is not the path that a company should take.
Yeah, John, I'm actually, I wanted to dig into this one a bit. So, repricing underwater stock options, we saw a lot of it after the dot-com bubble and then again, the financial crisis. I don't know that there's a 2-part question. So how prevalent are you finding it right now, this willingness to reprice, and how common is it compared with those 2 previous kind of downward market events? And the second part to that is the attitude of external investors, and I'm really thinking about the VC space now. Is that changing at all? Are there more conditions? Is there more yes buts that come with that kind of those downward those repricings?
Yeah, I like that. So I think it's helpful, and you teed it up perfectly in terms of thinking back to the dot-com. There's really been kind of maybe 2 waves or 3 phases of what I think of dealing with underwater options. So number 1 was kind of the dot-com phase. There, it was pre the current accounting rules, at least in the US. And it was predominantly tech companies that saw significant valuations from the tech bubble disappear virtually overnight. I think it was in kind of March 2020. In and that kind of wave obviously was concentrated in technology companies, and it was what we would call kind of a straight repricing. The companies would cancel the awards, they'd issue them back. There was a 6-month delay just because of a quirk in the accounting that drove those exchanges. But companies were largely able to do that on their own. What changed, though, is somewhere in, I think it was 2002 or 2003, in that kind of post-Enron phase, is shareholders' right to have a much greater say around equity programs for public companies. And some of that bleeds into private company practices as they get ready. But predominantly in the public space, all of a sudden now you had to go back to shareholders to get reauthorization of shares. You had, in many cases, to write, I won't reprice without shareholder approval into the plans. And it also coincided with the rise of our proxy advisors that we're quite familiar with, the policies. So the ways looked a lot different. This is where we saw coming out of the Great Recession, not just limited to tech, because almost all industries were impacted negatively by the housing bubble and the financial crisis. So we saw household names like a Starbucks actually do a repricing. We saw a lot of technology companies, life science. It was all industries. But what was different is they were exchanges. So more often than not, the value of the underwater options. I got 3 rotten bananas. I'm going to replace it with 1 fresh banana. Or in some cases, I'm going to switch to an apple, i.e. an RSU, because it seems tastier at the time. But the idea was much more shareholder friendly in this particular wave. Then, as we think about the current state and getting to your kind of 2-part question, what are we seeing now? And I'm going to just broadly say over the last 10 years, and probably applicable for the answering this question, is we have to keep in mind that there's been a massive shift to RSUs broad-based. So we're not seeing options on a broad-based in a broad-based way with public companies and late-stage private, with kind of limited exception of pre-commercial biotech, where cash is king and longevity is important. So the exchanges in the public space are going to be more limited to very industry-specific companies that grant a lot of options broad-based. Okay. And in that public space, most likely institutional investors have gotten involved. So they're much less likely to occur unless there's a very strong kind of insider presence or some other unique circumstances that allows them to get the vote, or they were able to kind of grandfather in a provision from when they were private, where they can just unilaterally affect a repricing, or there's downstream repercussions with, say, on pay votes and so forth, that might limit those companies. So much more limited concentration in the public space. Now, shifting to the second part of your question, VCs and just private companies. Here's where you're going to see companies dealing with underwater options more often, still at a much kind of lower prevalence rate. But certainly anytime there's kind of a correction in the broader public markets, likely maybe a corresponding correction on the 409A valuations because of how they peg to recent transactions and public company references. And so when an increase there, more often than not, it's going to be of the straight repricing, because it's a simple modification the company can affect, typically just with a board resolution. It may not even require further shareholder votes. Because of that, we don't see a lot of it. And so it's hard to pulse as to how companies are doing it, but we know there is a big uptick in the kind of total number, but as a prevalence percentage, it's probably low. I'm going to venture a guess in the percent or less range, just looking at maybe the last year. Final part of your question, VCs, how do they feel about it? I think it's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag. I do think VCs take a much better lens than the public markets do towards this idea that our force is part of our capital being deployed. I don't like referring to employees as capital, but if human capital certainly has become more cachet in the last few years, and I think it's very appropriate. Our employees produce things. And I think recognizing that equity is an important part of the total rewards package that incentivizes or retains employees, in exchange or repricing is a very efficient way to take that equity and put it back to work in a more productive way than leaving it underwater. So I think savvy VCs and other investors understand that. And in the case of a success fit, doing a repricing or doing an exchange ultimately often leads to less dilution. Because if companies don't reprice or exchange those options, they're going to layer on additional grants. And oftentimes, total quantity award is going to be more diluted.
And one thing you mentioned there as well, recognizing this important part of the total rewards equation. I guess my question is it? Is it still, particularly in that private space, given the downward valuations and the promised IPOs that never really happened and no one really knowing when that liquidity event's going to be or what the option's worth? I feel like the stock option had already kind of lost its sheen a little bit over the last few years. The number of people that got the golden ticket versus the number of people that didn't. People started to become more aware of the fact that it wasn't guaranteed millionaire status, right? What do you think of the perceptions of equity in the private space now? How important is it truly to delivering value to your employees?
Yeah. Great question. And you see me kind of smiling because I've heard some soapbox moments when it comes to thinking about options RSUs over the years. I'll try to give you the condensed version. But I think the massive shift to RSUs in the public space really just changed the mentality around equity awards. And in many ways, I think in a kind of a negative way. It's more often, to me, thought of as just part of compensation. We communicate things in dollar values. It vests, the dollar value is real. I mean, there's some benefits to that as well, but I believe it's kind of shifted some of the mindset and the comms around equity to just part of compensation and almost an entitlement. And I think some of that oftentimes bleeds into the private company space incorrectly, in the sense that as companies are recruiting maybe tech talent from some of the FANG organizations, and they're used to getting RSUs and they know the dollar value, and they come in and they're expecting something similar. What I think is lost here is two elements. Is equity is an opportunity to kind of create a culture around, hey, we're paying you a salary to kind of do your day-to-day job, but you're growing this really cool entity that hopefully we have a good culture we talk about a lot. The equity is a way to kind of combine that and make a connection between what you're doing, what we're growing, and then your potential value in this broader organization that you're building. So really kind of the ownership opportunity and not the compensation opportunity. Clearly, there's value that goes with the ownership, but by calling it comp, I think oftentimes we lose the message in it. Number two, and this is very unique for private companies, is options versus RSUs at a public company is not the same comparison at a private company. And the biggest difference is when we set the strike price. In the US, we know we have to set it current market price. In the public company setting, we know that that's the fair market value. That is the true value that's trading at any particular moment because we have buyers and sellers in the stock. That's fine. But we're in the private company. We have this concept of a 409A valuation. And calling it a business valuation is a complete misnomer. It's a tax exercise. And in many cases, this tax exercise creates this opportunity to create a disconnect between what might be the fair market value and what is this allowable tax value. And if anyone's worked with private companies, you know that even the board has some influence as to how that gets set. So we need to recognize, because there's an acceptable tax exercise that allows us 409A value that's much lower than maybe a preferred price. I mean, investors would just kill to buy in at a 409A price. That's all you have to ask to know that the 409A is a favorable price. So we need to think about stock options as in the money or discounted stock options when it's given to a private company employee. Now, there's drawbacks, liquidity, time horizon, everything else. But that's okay. You're buying into kind of building and that dream. The other kind of key benefit, in addition to that discounted strike price, is we have that time horizon that can be quite long, 10 years in most stock options. And the taxable event is tied to the exercise, not the vesting. And if anyone is granted RSUs in a private company setting and not thought about taxes and liquidity, and no difficulty that comes with using RSUs. So I think stock options are kind of a misunderstood vehicle when it comes to the private company setting, and still a fantastic mechanism. But because they're misunderstood, that means the communication, the education to the employees is even harder than it was 20 years ago when you just say, hey, here's some wallpaper potentially, but also could be $1 million.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. So that brings up, in my mind, something I've been thinking about quite a bit the past couple of years. As we think about equity as a long-term incentive vehicle, with the idea of helping drive retention, but also, John, to your point, like, hey, come help us build something fantastic and valuable over the long term. Um, that perception is key, right? Perception of value in in any element of rewards is really what drives the satisfaction and the engagement. And somewhere in the camp of like 85 to 90% of all companies are privately held, right? So I think there's a lot of employees out there who are in that situation where they don't have the really straightforward understanding of how valuable their equity is, right? So this is a question for John or for anyone in the whole group, but how do we, what do we do to be effective in communicating that value so that the perception is accurate, but also motivating for people to stay and retain and build when they're in this situation of having illiquid and imprecise valued um, uh, equity awards.
I'm happy to give a couple of I love that you asked the other panelists because, as I alluded to before, I learn a lot on these as well, particularly anyone who's been in-house and some of the messaging. You hit on something really interesting that I want to kind of double click on is this idea of perceived value and getting employees to kind of appreciate what they have. Because when we kind of get into education, there's elements of psychology that we're always kind of trying to tap into. We're avoiding, what is vest? Here's the definition. What is, what's a grant date? What's a vest? What's a strike price? It's important, but the two elements that we're trying to tap into from learning and perceived value is people learn better when you connect to something they already understand. And then the second element is building an appreciation or kind of increasing that perceived value is help them understand and visualize what could do in the future. Right. So when we set up the education, if there's something we can compare to another benefit package or to a 401k concept, then that's helping to kind of describe what we're doing. And then if we can illustrate kind of what value might look like in the future and what it means to be a shareholder. And a little bit easier in a public company setting where there has been some liquidity, but maybe there's been some liquidity events along the way for a private company. If you can even pull in some anecdotes of Sarah down the hall, cashed out 20% in the last round and used it to add a deck to her house with a hot tub, right? If you can kind of weave in those very personalized stories, I think you have a much better job of one, connecting the synapses in people's brains to be like, oh, this is not just that wallpaper that I joked about earlier. This could be something real. And then more importantly, where I think, and it's hard to measure, so this is just John's, perception or opinion, is Chris is going to go ask Sarah about that. And Sarah's going to help inform him and educate him what it meant 2 years ago when she was able to cash out. And then on the next liquidity event or when the grant comes in or, anything that's kind of related to it, hopefully then Sarah's carrying some we do have to be careful because there's a lot of misinformation in Slack channel. Sometimes you'd be amazed at like what employees communicate to others. But the thing that even is where something might not be completely correct, go and provide information. There's oftentimes a lot of enthusiasm that comes whatever the questions and the answers are coming, and that enthusiasm, I think, is really key to building some. So I said I'd pause. I'd love to hear other people's kind of perspective around helping employees understand or have higher perception of equity.
Yeah, I like what you shared, John, as far as giving a specific example of just how somebody has benefited from the long-term value of their equity. And I was thinking about an example from Starbucks that I had come across many years ago, where it's, one of the first partners, baristas, because the company Starbucks, they have broad-based, I would say, stock participation. So everybody down to the barista front line, is eligible for equity. And there was a barista who, had held on to her equity for a long time, saw the value of her equity grow over time, and was able to pay off her college tuition. And I think that's a pretty remarkable story and just very practical example of how equity can be liquidated and really help you in your achieving your personal life goals. So I think the more examples that we can provide to employees, to your point around just what's the value of holding on to the equity long term, that's really going to drive more value to the program.
Yeah, and Justin, I'm glad you mentioned Starbucks. Starbucks was the first company that I worked at where there was just the equity component of everybody's pay was so highly emphasized. And one of the things that I found was it was actually the first company where I took, and I was still junior in my career. I think I've been in a comp for 2.5, 3 years when I started with Starbucks, but it was actually the first company where I actually genuinely, personally, really understood and cared about the value of the company and how the company was performing. So from that perspective, it was the first tool that actually aligned my behavior towards kind of what the company's goals were. And I thought that was a really interesting component of the equity program that I had never considered prior to going into that. Now that I've been there, it is a very great way to kind of make sure that employees are aligned to the growth and the success of the company.
Yeah, that's I think it's a great example. Moving from maybe one part of the economy where stock isn't quite as available on a broad-based perspective, you go to the tech industry where it just seems to be, business as usual. I was really interested, John, in your take on, I think, Clay, you mentioned that word retention. Is there any more retentive value when we think about stock? And I'm thinking, there's obviously a huge difference between options and RSUs, but we've also seen vesting schedules change as well. Some of them have accelerated from a 4-year vesting schedule to a 3-year. Some of them have front loaded the vesting schedule where it's you get, 2/3 of the value in the first 2 years. Is there any more retentive value to stock the way that we're using it today? Or is it just another component that, obviously you want to communicate well and do well, but is it truly a long-term incentive the way that we term it?
I'll happily jump in on this one a bit because I question the notion that equity is a retentive component of pay for 2 reasons. The first is chances are you can get more out of a new hire grant at a new place. So it's very difficult to match with a refresh grant or an ongoing grant in a public company what a candidate could get as a new hire grant from a new company. And if you're trying to, you're going to burn through equity like crazy. So I question whether the idea of having unvested equity on the table, so when we talk about vested and unvested, whether you can actually get to it or not. Unvested means you can't get to that equity and you lose it if you lose the company. So I think the idea of having a ton of unvested equity on the table as a retentive component of pay, I've never quite believed that it truly does what people say it does. And when you look at the turnover rates in tech, I kind of think it supports that notion. And the second point I'd make around this is, do you really want employees sticking around just because they've got invested equity on the table? So that shouldn't be the reason that your employees stay with the company. They should stay with the company because they want to be in the company and they enjoy their work and they enjoy being productive and they believe in the mission. So I've always kind of felt that it's very easy to look at numbers as a solution to total rewards issues like retention. And so, if we give people more money, they're going to stay. And to some extent, they probably will. It will work in certain scenarios, but I'd say the real longer term solution to retention is it comes back to those more complex issues around developing a positive EVP and delivering on that EVP and getting your culture and your career opportunities right. So that's just my take on that one.
Yeah, I think I agree with that kind of wholeheartedly. In many ways and many different so kind of what you're getting at. I mean, we have studied kind of the impact of timing of vesting and whether that influences whether we kind of see voluntary turnover blips. And absolutely can discern in annual vesting of RSUs, see how there's some packing of the turnover rates shortly after that vesting. But to James' point, that may not actually be equity awards creating retention. That people, it's not necessarily people are staying; it's that people who have likely decided to exit have chosen their exit date based off when a vesting is going to occur, right? So in that sense, I kind of fully agree with it. And to James' kind of more cynical point, which I also agree with, is do you really want the people who are sticking around to get another vesting or because of the equity? Is that the right people? So I think equity is something that supports, when done well, supports what you're already doing from a business strategy and from a culture. And we kind of talk about this a little bit kind of internally as we've growing our own organization and recruiting people and thinking about it. And this isn't specific to equity, but we've kind of coalesced around this idea that employees really are looking for three things from their employment. They want to who they work with. There's a whole book with no a-holes. I'll save you, Justin, from having to bleep off any of my my actual words here. But you want to like who you work with. Number two is you want to feel well compensated for it. Number three is you want to feel purpose or an understanding of what you're doing in your career. And if employees have all three, that's fantastic, right? If you have two of those three, you can often get by if one of the two of those that you do have kind of overweights the other. But when you start to lose more than one of those elements, that's usually when companies are coming to play. So for the same reason we say that pay doesn't keep people in their isn't reason to leave. It should be aligned and supportive of what they're doing. So all of that's the same retention when we attract, retain, and motivate. I think the retention aspect is overweighted, and it's absolutely from an attraction standpoint, as James mentioned. Oftentimes, new hires could be more than what you're currently holding. But the part of kind of motivate, I want to twist that a little bit around just kind of alignment, because not everyone is motivated. But if you're going to give equity, they should at least have that understanding of where the alignment is. Why are you giving this to me? What's the purpose? And then what does it mean to me? And how does it align with what I'm doing? That part I think is important versus I got an RSU grant and now I'm going to work harder, because I just don't think that actually happens.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, John. I think that it's important to understand how the rewards that we provide do kind of drive the business results that we're after. But I think it does bring us kind of to a nice couple of questions around kind of some more basic questions in terms of who should get equity awards and how are those being decided. Many companies that I've been at, it's been the whole gamut. Starbucks, for example, as we mentioned, baristas and up. At other companies I've been at, it was directors and up. I'm curious, and I think it, of course, we're gonna have the answer. It depends. But when we think of different kinds of levels, where are you seeing the most effective equity grants being placed? Do you think it starts at the barista level, or does it really kind of focus on the director level, because it is a finite pool?
Yeah, I think there's
Yeah.
so I want to caveat that a lot of my clients tend to be VC-backed tech companies based in the Bay Area, and so that is a very, that is a bubble, and equity is highly prevalent. And of course, this isn't the same in other countries and other industries. But I think even in that bubble, I think there's maybe some misconceptions around what equity really means to people. And if you talk to an exec who's bought into the mission, they think everyone needs to get equity. It's really important. We're going to be worth, 10x in a year's time, et cetera, which is great. That's what you want from a founder. But I don't think everyone else shares in that. And I think when you really look at it, typically engineering, the engineers are often interested. But I wouldn't. I would say that I don't think that view is shared by the rest of the organization, and it's kind of looked at as a nice to have, and the rest of that organization, even junior engineers, I would say, you have to point Justin below the director level, and not the ones that they truly make the effort to understand that equity, and therefore really don't really perceive the value in them.
Yeah, I would say where I've personally seen it to be less common is for support level roles. Because when I think about kind of your frontline worker, whether it's barista or technician or a real retail person in the sales floor, they are living paycheck to paycheck, so they need that money right away. They don't really value that stock in the same way that somebody who's making six figures would value stock. And so I think you have to really understand kind of the employee persona and what their needs and lifestyle requirements are to build those effective programs. And then I think I've seen organizations where as you've all pointed out, it's been mostly common to limit equity plans to the management level. So people managers at a certain level and above. And sometimes it's 100% participation, meaning everybody gets it. Other times it's limited, particularly if it's maybe a non-tech function. So if you're like in finance or marketing, where maybe the prevalence of offering equity is lower, you might differentiate who gets an equity award based on factors such as performance and potential. And so it's sometimes it's everybody gets it, but other times it's more varied based on an individual's performance and potential.
I think there's three factors, and you guys have touched on each one of them that comes into play here. And when we're kind of doing an equity strategy, whether it's a brand new plan or kind of update guidelines after a few years, oftentimes I'll include this graphic that's got three circles. And if you think of just a Venn diagram where you're looking for that intersection, those three circles kind of represent what you guys have been talking about. There's the philosophy. In the case of Starbucks, I mean, it started from day one where Howard Schultz says, I want everyone to be an owner and I want them to have healthcare. And that's what they've executed on now for, I think it's 30 years. So there's the philosophy element that I talked about earlier. There is the competitiveness / benchmarking, right? And we've touched on that. If it's tech roles, oftentimes you're giving them equity to stay competitive, and you're deciding how much based off of benchmarking. So that's another circle. And the third one, Justin, you talked about it in the intro to your question, is this idea of affordability. You can say you want to do this. The data can say you should do this. But then when you roll it all together across your organization, you've got a 8% rate. And that's not sustainable in most situations. So in kind of that depends. It often depends for the company how those three circles are drawn as to how they make those decisions. And most equity strategies go through this evolution, particularly once either they bring on more investors or go public, where that affordability may not have been as important in the past, but becomes increasingly important. Or we've got dollar denominated RSU guidelines and the stock price dropped 40%. We thought our program worked perfectly until now we have to grant 2 times as many shares. So affordability ends up being sometimes this trump card to force harder decisions on either philosophy or the benchmarking position. But understanding kind of that it's those three circles that come into play, and those circles change over time as the company changes and as the broader industry changes. But you're always trying to balance those elements to determine and make those decisions. But it doesn't mean you always make them the right way.
Yeah, one thing, Justin, that you mentioned earlier, global equity or how equity is perceived, outside the US. I think it's fair to say that the US is where equity dominates. The further you go, the less important it becomes, and I generally see it as a west to east type thing. It has certainly become a bigger deal in Western Europe over recent years, and you've even seen places like France, which are historically very tricky to award equity, talk about loosening their restrictions around equity in order to compete with US-based tech companies to nurture their own business and adopt a similar award system. But historically, it's just not been used as a vehicle for award on continental Europe. It's just not that important. And so local companies around the world often just don't use equity to the same degree or be used in that traditional sense for executives and above, the actual drivers of the business. But what you do see is US headquartered companies use equity globally, which I think is good because it differentiates your value proposition as a US headquartered company competing with local companies around the world. And then you start to get into this arena, well, then how much? And how do you create those guidelines? And you start to see the typical practice to kind of create tiers of discounts globally, like 3 or maybe 4 tiers, and where you kind of have that percentage discount based on the US guideline. But what I would say is even with those guidelines, I don't see the utilization being as high. And like even with the guidelines in place, the proportion of people that will receive an ongoing grant or a refresh grant tends to be much lower. So the actual quantum of shares that gets used internationally, I find is a lot lower than the US. But I'm keen to hear other opinions on that as well.
Yeah, I have limited experience with global equity, but I can share anecdotally when I was head of comp for Big Fish Games when we were acquired by an Australian company. Big Fish Games headquartered in Seattle with an office in Oakland. Equity was, it was table stakes. You had to have equity for some portion of the business to be competitive with the companies that were in those areas, and that was a very large surprise, I think, to the board of the acquiring company in Australia. But Australia actually has very different rules around equity as well. And James, to your point, it's much less prevalent. But one of the takeaways I learned from that was in Australia, for example, if the shareholders struck down proposed grant guidelines from a particular company 3 times, then the comp committee would be disbanded. So it was a bit more of a skin in the game for Australian companies. So it was a very interesting learning experience, and then trying to figure out how do you balance what makes you competitive in Seattle and in Oakland versus what are kind of the confines that you must live with to satisfy kind of companies on different, they have different rules and regulations.
Yeah, I would say Australia is definitely a complicated country. I'm trying to remember the times when I've worked with the stock communication in the past, but there's even specific regulations, if I recall, about the employee finding out about their equity award, before their manager finds out, or there's just certain steps you have to take in terms of how the stock grants are communicated. And yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about how many different stock groups does it make sense to have globally, I always think about how do you balance the level of precision that you want to have relative to the market data versus how do you communicate that clearly and simply to employees. So I've seen organizations that discount their equity for non-US locations by 5% increments. And so they'll maybe have 6 or 7 different tiers of equity. And they don't communicate that broadly with employees. And then there's other organizations where they say, we have 3 different stock groups, and we discounted each of these groups by 10 to 15%, and we're going to be transparent about that with employees. So I think when you think about kind of how you communicate these programs to employees from a pay transparency perspective, that might also be a factor that affects the design of your programs.
I wanted to highlight Eric's question because I think we have to talk about long-term cash to some extent. If we're talking about equity, obviously that's the dominant player in a lot of organizations. But this idea of long-term cash, I think I have seen more. Certainly, one of the big articles that came out recently was Levels.fyi. They published some information about how OpenAI is doing their profit shares, sort of a profit approach where it's really because they're a private company, they don't have shares yet, so they're using things like almost a profit sharing approach. So I'd be interested to hear about anybody's interaction with those types of plans, if cash is still an option, especially for private companies there.
Yeah, so I've done a little bit of reading just in terms of kind of some of the blogs and what's been written out there. So certainly probably some blind spots on the in the weeds details. But the first aspect of it is when we see things written as profits interests, the biggest reason you're seeing profits interest and not stock options is that the corporation, excuse me, the entity status is going to be a limited liability company as opposed a corporation. Like we see most VC backed are going to be corporations. So the idea of a stock option is unique, specific to a corporation. Profits interest is unique to an LLC. Has a lot of flexibility under the code that you can design it basically to be more broadly what we would call an appreciation vehicle. The idea being the economic value based on how to grow the business, in this case, the profits. So you can think of it, if designed the same way, it's very much like a stock option and can convey similar aspects of it, but just has to follow a different set of tax requirements. Separately, just like a stock option, or it could be a association right, there's a decision where companies could utilize cash to settle an award. I would say no, because in their age, it's probably more about revenue and not about profitability. So the availability of cash is a limiting factor. But from a controlling dilution, from dealing with the liquidity challenges that come with private company equity, settling in cash takes care of that. So while it's not a big trend, and the limiting factor, as I said, is just more about availability of cash and focused on growth, I think it's a fantastic thing to consider if cash is going to be available. Eric, in the public space, we have seen an increase in the number of cash-based long-term vehicles, but again, for very much the same reasons. It's the matter of resources being available. So if cash is more available than equity, it certainly is a reasonable time to look at. One thing to note about kind of long-term cash from a vesting and earnout and everything else, think of it in the same bucket as RSUs, as 498. So with cash, you never get the concept of flexible timing on exercise like you do with stock options. If you're dealing with fixed periods of time, it can be a great allocation of that resource.
I'm going to add one very quick point to on cash LTI as well. Don't underestimate how difficult it is for people to understand it if you add any complexity. So keep it simple is my advice with any long-term cash plan. Like phantom options and internal valuations to drive phantom option programs, all this kind of stuff. On paper, mathematically great, tons of fun to design and model, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that very few people are going to know what any of that means. And even profit interest units are relatively unfamiliar, even though they're fairly common among LLCs. So I think when long-term cash is done well, it's basically just a deferred bonus. Let people know what they're going to receive and when they're going to receive it, maybe with minimal tethers to company performance, if it's clear and understandable.
Great. Well, thanks, James, for that. Well, we're running up to about the last 5 minutes. So in that time, what I'd like to do is we'll run around the room real quick and just do a quick final thought. But before we do that, I would like to say once again, thank you very much to Jon Burg of Infinite Equity for joining us. And then, Jon, make sure that you mention how folks can get a hold of you as we're wrapping up. And I'd also like to mention that on September 22nd, James is going to be hosting a webinar with his team from NUA Group. So we're excited for that as well. And then we'll also be kicking off a new PAPE practitioners panel on September 22nd that will include myself, Catherine Dovey, Greg Roche, Jennifer Hastrick of Korn Ferry, Sherry Nornez of Morgan HR, Nancy Romanishin of Syndio, and Jaime Morfin-Stupin of Sweldos.com. So let's just do quick final thoughts on our last PAPE practitioners panel with this group. And again, thanks, John. If you'd like to kind of start with your final thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, and I think I might dovetail on James's last comment about keep it simple, because I actually think that is appropriate. We can get very fancy, but I oftentimes in getting involved, I go down the middle of the fairway from a design standpoint and really put more of the emphasis on how you're going to communicate it, because equity is a unique opportunity to actually market the program and sell it. You don't get to do salary or base wages. So really think about communicating why the purpose of this is, what the benefit is, and really helping employees at least appreciate what they're receiving. I think that actually can come before understanding it because of the difference. But yeah, keep it simple design. James?
Yeah, I think just for the benefit of our audience, I know a lot of people are very daunted by equity and starting to get involved in it. So my advice is take your time with if you're new to equity. There's a lot of jargon, and learn an initialism a day or exam a day, and slowly build up that understanding. And it's one of these wonderful areas. I feel like I learn something new all the time. I learned some new things today. So thanks very much, John, for joining. But don't try and expect to understand it all overnight. Take your time when you're learning this topic. But it's a wonderful understanding to have, and in a career as a comm professional, it's a really powerful tool to have in your toolkit.
Great, thanks, James. Chad, any last words?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate, John, your time as well. And my brain is definitely turning around the idea of how do you reinforce the idea of performance with stock. So I'm just thinking about it even from a product perspective. How do you display this information? Because we've traditionally done a lot of like looking back potentially at sort of what's vesting at what time and what you received, and kind of combining deferred bonuses and all these other things. It gets mixed up very quickly. And you lose that element of how this actually relates to the performance of the company and the individual and everything. So I think that's takeaway for me is how can we reiterate that message a little bit more around performance.
Yeah, and then I would just say it's helpful to be really aware of kind of the statistics in your labor market, and just what information are employees getting and how are they perceiving it. If you look at the stats on average age of company to IPO, it just keeps going up. And so employees are going to be likely waiting longer if you're in one of these, in a private company, especially. Employees are going to be waiting longer for that, for their equity to materialize into dollars. And so being aware of that, being aware of their position and their perception, and trying to really be in their shoes when you think about designing and especially communicating ongoing with employees about their equity awards.
Yeah, I would plus one what you just shared, Clay and Chad, as far as just being intentional with the communication and not just being random about the allocation of equity awards, but really making sure managers have talking points to message to employees why they're getting that award, whether it's performance or potential based. And then I think just being cognizant to John's points earlier around understanding what your financials look like with how much spend you are doing with your LTI per FTE, or even looking at what your LTI spend as a percent of your revenue and gross profit, and how productive are your employees, and are you managing to burn rates and dilution rates, because those are very real metrics that we have to hold ourselves accountable to especially with the volatility in the stock prices in the market right now. So it's not a one size fits all programmatic design. It's got to be what you do has to be authentic to your industry and to your philosophy and talent philosophy. But there's a lot of different metrics and levers that you can balance against to create the best program.
Well, again, thank you guys, everybody, so much for joining. And again, special thanks to Jon. Really appreciate everybody's time. And we will look forward to seeing you with the brand new practitioners panel on September 22nd.